I'm sure many of you are familiar with the story of Job. In Job chapter 9, this is what we read. Job is saying, "He is not a mere mortal like me, that I might answer him, that we might confront each other in court. If only there were someone to mediate between us, someone to bring us together, someone to remove God's rod from me, so that his terror would frighten me no more. Then I would speak up without fear of him. But as it now stands with me, I cannot." So Job, of course, has lost everything. He's lost material possessions. He's lost family. He's lost health. Job has lost literally everything except for his own life. And he's here complaining. It's like, I want God to understand me. I want to complain against God, but I feel like God is so distant. I feel like God doesn't really understand the pain and the suffering that I'm going through right now. If God were just a man like I was, or like I am, then I could take my complaint to him. Even if there was somebody perhaps that could stand between us, someone that could translate for us, so that God would understand me and so that I could understand God. If there were just a mediator, somebody to bridge that gap. But as it now stands, Job says, I feel so distant. I feel so removed from God, and I feel like God doesn't and cannot really understand me. Now, Job doesn't realize it at this moment. But what he's really asking for in Job chapter 9 is he's asking for a priest. He's asking for a high priest. And the request that Job makes, the complaint that Job makes in Job 9, is finally answered in the person of Jesus. Now, the comparison between Jesus and the high priest is a comparison that is one of the biggest ideas that runs through almost all the chapters in the book of Hebrews. In chapter 1, going all the way back to the beginning, Hebrews tells us of Jesus that after he had provided purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty in heaven. Providing purification for sins is the job of a priest. Sitting down at the right hand of the Majesty, that's what a king does. So Jesus is our unique priest king. In chapter 2, Hebrews returns back to this idea of a high priest, and he says that Jesus is a merciful and a faithful high priest who makes atonement for our sins, who helps us in our temptations. In chapter 3, verse 1, Hebrews says of Jesus that he is our apostle, which is, that word is never applied to Jesus any other places in the New Testament except for the book of Hebrews. It says Jesus is our apostle. Apostle means envoy. It means representative. But he's also our high priest, whom we confess. So Jesus is our apostle and our high priest. No other place in the New Testament is Jesus explicitly referred to with that language either. In chapter 4, we have this extended passage starting in verse 14. It says, "Therefore, since we have a great high priest who has ascended into heaven, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith that we profess. For we don't have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who's been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet did not sin. Let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need." Now, over the next few chapters, after chapter 4, what he does is he elaborates on what it means to call Jesus our high priest. Before I go any further, though, I want to try to give you a picture. I want to try to give you an understanding of the role that the high priest served to the Jewish people. The high priest was essentially a bridge. The high priest was a bridge that connected God to his people and the people to God. The priest was a living, walking, talking bridge between God and his people. And everything about the high priest was intended to communicate that central message. Even the way that the priest dressed in his sacred garments were intended to communicate this message that he was a bridge between the people. The garments of the high priest were made actually out of the same materials that the tabernacle itself was made out of. So literally, the priest was a walking embodiment of the tabernacle. The priest wore a blue garment over his white robe. And the color blue was a color that was meant to symbolize the heavens. Blue coverings were also used over the various furniture of the tabernacle while it was being moved. The priest had stones on each shoulder, an onyx stone on each shoulder, with the names of the tribes of Israel on each stone. The priest also had a breastplate, and on this breastplate there were 12 precious stones, and these 12 precious stones were meant to represent the nation of Israel. And so the priest, when he went into the most holy place, when he went into the presence of God in the tabernacle or in the temple later on, the priest would literally go in with the nation of Israel on his shoulders and on his heart. So the priest, if just looking at the priest, you would get two ideas. You would get, first of all, the idea that the priest was set apart. He was set apart from the people to be a bridge to God. But you would also get this idea that the priest identifies with us. The priest is taking us with him into the very presence of God. So the priest formed this vital, living link between God and his people. And so when Hebrews latches onto this idea, what Hebrews wants us to know is, not only is Jesus greater than the prophets and the angels and Moses and Joshua, he's also greater even than the high priest in so far as he's able to provide that connection, that vital connection between us and our God. The point that Hebrews tries to make is, with all this imagery, with all these pictures of the high priest, what we have in Jesus is the real thing. Jesus is the reality. He is our bridge. And he makes this point in a kind of unusual way through a guy named Melchizedek. Now, I get all sorts of questions about Melchizedek when people find out that I teach Hebrews. Tell me about Melchizedek. Who is Melchizedek? He first introduces him in chapter 6, verse 20, when he says of Jesus that he's become a high priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. Now, we don't know a lot about Melchizedek. He's only mentioned in 2 different passages in the Bible outside of the book of Hebrews. He's mentioned in Genesis chapter 14. And in Genesis chapter 14, he enters the stage really quickly, and almost as soon as he enters the stage, he exits the stage. He is this rather obscure priest/king that Abram meets after one of his military conquests, and he blesses Abram, and Abram responds by giving him a 10th of the plunder from this military victory that he's won. And he's called a priest of God Most High, and that's all that we know about him, until we get to Psalm 110. And in Psalm 110, we are told that of this promise. We're told of this oath that of God's chosen one, he would be a priest in the order of Melchizedek. So when God sends his chosen one, when God sends his Messiah, he will be a priest just like Melchizedek. And that's the only 2 passages outside of Hebrews where we learn about this Melchizedek character. But the reason why Hebrews talks so much about Melchizedek is because Psalm 110 is his very favorite Old Testament passage. Psalm 110 is the passage that he quotes more than any other passage from the Old Testament. And in Hebrews chapter 7, especially in Hebrews chapter 7, he's commenting on Psalm 110. So if he's going to comment on Psalm 110, he's going to have to talk about Melchizedek, and that's what he does. That's what he does. So he says that Jesus is a priest unlike any other priest that we've seen before. He's not like the Levitical priest who come from the tribe of Levi. He's of a different order altogether. He's the Levitical, he's from the order of Melchizedek. Now, the Levitical high priest was limited in several different ways. It was first of all limited by ancestry. It was limited by ancestry. You could only become high priest if you were from the tribe of Levi, and specifically from the family of Aaron. Now that's a problem for Jesus, because Jesus was not from the tribe of Levi. Jesus was from the tribe of Judah, which was the tribe of kings, not the tribe of priests. But in order to be a high priest, you were limited by your ancestry. You could only become a high priest based on your genealogy, based on those who had come before you. And you could only become high priest once somebody else had died. And so you were limited in that capacity, limited by a limited ancestry. The Levitical high priest was also limited by weak sacrifices. This is another point that Hebrews makes. The high priest could only offer sacrifices of bulls and goats, the blood of animals, and Hebrews says very clearly, we'll get into this in some other sessions, but Hebrews says very clearly these sacrifices were weak. The blood of bulls and the blood of goats, it can't really remove sin. It can't really cleanse our conscience. And so the Levitical priest was limited by these weak sacrifices. The Levitical priest was also limited by his own sin. The priest himself was a sinner. And because the priest himself was a sinner, he was always limited in his capacity to restore people back to their God. Finally, the priest was limited ultimately by his own death. Limited by his own death. The Levitical priest died. And because of that, they don't have an enduring priesthood the way that Jesus does. And so he says in chapter 7, verse 23, he says, "Now there have been many of those priests, since death prevented them from continuing in office. But because Jesus lives forever, he has a permanent priesthood. Therefore, he is able to save completely." Literally, it says they're saved to the uttermost. He's able to save completely those who come to God through him, because he always lives, he continues to live to intercede for them. Such a high priest truly meets our needs. One who is holy, blameless, pure, set apart from sinners, and exalted above the heavens. Unlike the other high priests, he doesn't need to offer sacrifices day after day, first for his own sins, and then for the sins of the people. He sacrificed for their sins once for all when he offered himself. This is no weak sacrifice. For the law appoints as high priest men in all their weakness, but the oath, which came after the law, is referring to Psalm 110, appointed the Son who has been made priest forever. Now Melchizedek, this is how he begins chapter 7. Melchizedek was a high priest who wasn't limited by his ancestry. Matter of fact, we don't know anything about who Melchizedek's parents even were. We don't know what tribe he came from. We don't even know if he was of the nation of Israel. It doesn't seem like he was. So he wasn't limited by his ancestry. He wasn't limited by his death because we don't know anything about Melchizedek, his birth or his death. So Melchizedek is just of a different order altogether. And Hebrews says Jesus is our high priest, but he's not like any other high priest that we've seen. If you're wanting a picture of what his priesthood looks like, it looks more like Melchizedek than it does like Levi. Here's the point. Here's the application that we need to make from this. All this priestly imagery and sacrifices and all this stuff, it feels so removed from our immediate experience. Until you go back and you think about Job, and you think about the distance that he felt between God and himself, and he longed for someone to truly bridge the gap. Hebrews comes along and says, we have a high priest who meets our need in every way. We have a high priest who meets our need in every way. He is holy, he is blameless, he is pure. He says he has ascended into the heavens itself. He doesn't serve in some man-made structure. He doesn't serve in the tabernacle. He doesn't even serve in the temple. He serves in the very presence of God. We have an all-sufficient high priest who's made a sacrifice of himself so that our sins could be completely dealt with and our consciences can be made clean. We have a high priest who meets our needs in every way, and he isn't even limited by death. He continues to live forever because he has defeated death. And so here's the message when it comes to perseverance. The message is, why would you abandon such a high priest? Why would you abandon such a bridge? When God has been able to bridge that gap for us and bring us near to him, why would you abandon that? You need to persevere because you have this all-sufficient high priest. So as we close this session, I want you to go back and I want you to read chapter 4, verses 14 through 16. And I want you to read it with these lenses. I want you to think through, what do these verses tell me as an encouragement about Jesus and his priesthood. What can I learn? How can I be encouraged from these verses about what it means to call Jesus my truly sufficient high priest? What difference does that really make in my life? What difference does that make in my discipleship? What does it mean to draw near to God with boldness, with sincerity? Talk about what that looks like. We have a bridge, and his name is Jesus. We have an all-sufficient high priest, and his name is Jesus. But he's not like any high priest we've ever seen before, and that's a good thing.